Have you ever built something so deeply personal, something that carried your memories, your grief, and your hope for the future, only to have it threatened by someone drunk on power? That was the reality for Ezra Thornfield, a man who thought he had finally found peace until his local HOA turned his dream into a battlefield. Ezra was 52 years old, a seasoned structural engineer who had spent decades designing skyscrapers and bridges across the country. But behind his steady career lay a personal tragedy. His wife, Marjorie, the love of his life, had passed away far too soon. After her death, Ezra felt hollow, drifting through his days, holding himself together with work, but never truly living. That all changed when he decided to honor her memory in a way that felt true to both of them. He purchased a plot of land in the Pine Ridge Mountains, where the air was sharp and clean, where the forests rolled endlessly, and where silence felt healing instead of heavy. On that land, Ezra poured his skills, his sweat, and his heart into building a sustainable mountain home. This wasn't just a house, it was a living tribute. The beams of reclaimed wood carried stories of old barns, the solar panels gleamed with independence, and the wide windows looked out on wildflowers and trees Marjorie would have adored. For Ezra, the home was part therapy, part engineering marvel, and entirely his sanctuary. For a brief while, it seemed perfect. He woke up to birdsong, spent evenings tending a vegetable garden, and felt, for the first time in years, like he was healing. Neighbors admired his craftsmanship. Friends visited and felt inspired. Ezra believed he had found a community that respected peace and independence. But peace never lasts long when corruption lurks nearby. Enter Cordelia Blackthornne, the HOA president of Pine Ridge Estates. If Ezra's home was built on love and memory, Cordelia's power was built on greed and intimidation. Tall, severe, and always dressed like she was heading into a courtroom, Cordelia wielded the HOA bylaws like weapons. She claimed it was about community standards, but everyone knew it was about control and money. Ezra's first clash with Cordelia seemed small at the time. He had planted native wildflowers around his property, splashes of color meant to attract bees, butterflies, and birds. To him, it was beautiful, natural, and perfectly aligned with the environment. But Cordelia didn't see wildflowers. She saw a violation. Unkempt landscaping, she declared in a letter, along with a $250 fine. Ezra laughed it off at first, thinking it was a misunderstanding. Surely once he explained the purpose of the flowers, the fine would disappear. He was wrong. The next notice came a week later. His vegetable garden, a small patch of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, was against aesthetic rules. Another fine. Then came absurdities. The angle of his parked truck was unsightly. His doormat was non-compliant. Even the shade of paint on his mailbox, barely distinguishable from the approved color, was suddenly grounds for punishment. Ezra realized quickly that this wasn't about flowers, gardens, or doormats. This was about Cordelia's power, and she wasn't acting alone. At her side was her cousin Rex, a bulky man desperate to play the role of enforcer. He strutted through the neighborhood with a clipboard, taking photos of violations, sometimes even stepping onto private property without permission. Residents whispered about Rex, about how he enjoyed intimidation a little too much, about how his loyalty to Cordelia went beyond family and veered into obsession. Ezra could have caved, could have paid the fines and tried to keep his head down. But that wasn't in his nature. As a structural engineer, he was meticulous, logical, and stubborn when it came to doing things right. He began digging into the HOA's rules, reading the fine print, studying amendments. What he uncovered shocked him. Cordelia had been quietly rewriting rules, slipping in amendments without proper votes, and enforcing them selectively. She and her board allies used fines to funnel money into maintenance projects that never happened. Meanwhile, properties owned by Cordelia's friends mysteriously avoided violations, even when they broke the same rules. It wasn't just corruption, it was fraud. Ezra started documenting everything. He took photos, kept copies of every letter, even recorded encounters with Rex when the man trespassed on his land. The more he uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Cordelia had turned the HOA into her personal kingdom, but fighting her wouldn't be easy. Cordelia had connections, legal, financial, and social. Residents feared retaliation. Those who spoke up often found themselves drowning in fines, their property values threatened, their peace shattered. Many simply paid up and stayed quiet. Ezra wasn't so easily silenced. One evening, as he sat on his porch with a stack of HOA documents, he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every homeowner who had been bullied, every neighbor who had paid a bogus fine, every person who had watched Cordelia strut through Pine Ridge Estates like she owned it. And in that moment, Ezra Thornfield decided he wasn't going to bend. He wasn't going to break. He was going to fight. What he didn't know yet was just how deep Cordelia's corruption ran, or how far she would go to keep her empire intact. At first, Ezra thought the fines and notices were just petty harassment, a nuisance he could swat away with logic and evidence. But Cordelia Blackthornne was not the type to back down. When she realized Ezra wasn't intimidated, she doubled down. It began with inspections, unannounced, intrusive, and often completely fabricated. Rex, her loyal enforcer, would stroll up Ezra's driveway, clipboard in hand, snapping pictures of infractions that didn't exist. A perfectly stacked woodpile became a safety hazard. A small rainwater barrel was suddenly illegal water storage. Even a wind chime hanging from Ezra's porch was deemed noise pollution. Each bogus violation came with another fine, and the stack of letters on Ezra's counter grew thicker by the week. But this wasn't just about paper threats anymore. One morning, Ezra woke up to find his garden trampled, tomato plants smashed, herbs ripped from the soil. Another time, someone had sprayed his shed with bright orange paint. Graffiti scrawled across the boards like a warning. And then there was the worst, a notice pinned to his door while he was away at his father's funeral. The letter claimed the HOA had voted to demolish his home for non-compliance with community standards. Ezra knew it wasn't legal, knew they couldn't possibly enforce it, but the timing wasn't an accident. Cordelia had waited until he was vulnerable, mourning, to strike with her cruelest move yet. That was the night something in Ezra hardened. This wasn't just corruption. This was personal. Cordelia and Rex weren't going to stop until they broke him. So Ezra did what he knew best. He built a plan. He formed a small circle of allies, neighbors who were tired of Cordelia's reign but had been too afraid to act alone. Together they called themselves the Pine Ridge Truth Group. They met quietly in Ezra's living room, stacks of documents and laptops spread across the reclaimed wood table he had built himself. Ezra showed them everything he'd uncovered, the forged amendments, the missing funds, the selective enforcement. And soon, others began sharing their own stories. A family fined $500 because their child's bike was left on the lawn. An elderly couple charged thousands for unauthorized roof repairs when their roof hadn't been touched in years. Every testimony painted the same picture. Cordelia's HOA wasn't just strict, it was predatory. The Truth Group began collecting evidence. They photographed Cordelia's own backyard, where violations went ignored. They tracked payments, noting how fines disappeared into vague maintenance projects that never materialized. They combed through county records and found discrepancies in property boundaries, where Cordelia had quietly expanded HOA jurisdiction without approval, roping in new homeowners and forcing them under her control. The deeper they dug, the uglier it became. Not only was Cordelia forging amendments, but she was also funneling HOA funds into companies tied to her cousins. Rex himself had been paid thousands for security services, though all he ever did was strut around with his clipboard. Ezra documented everything with the precision of an engineer. He knew facts alone weren't enough. He needed airtight proof, undeniable evidence that would hold up in court or in front of state regulators. But the more progress the Truth Group made, the more dangerous Cordelia became. Rex escalated his intimidation tactics. One night, Ezra caught him lurking near his property line, flashlight in hand, muttering about violations. Another time, Ezra's truck tires were mysteriously slashed. And then there were the anonymous letters, slipped under his door, scrawled in shaky handwriting, warning him to drop it before it gets worse. Instead of scaring him off, each act of harassment only fueled Ezra's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every neighbor who had been silenced, every family forced to pay money they didn't owe, every homeowner too tired or too scared to push back. And slowly, his bravery began to ripple outward. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet started attending truth group meetings. Some brought boxes of old HOA records they had saved out of suspicion. Others told stories of Cordelia threatening to foreclose on their homes over a few $100s in fines. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and the scale of the fraud was undeniable. Still, Cordelia wasn't finished. At the next HOA meeting, she arrived in full force, papers stacked high, Rex at her side, her voice slicing through the room like a knife. She declared Ezra a repeat offender, demanded his immediate expulsion from the community, and even threatened to place a lien on his home. But this time, Ezra was ready. Calmly, he stood up, holding a binder filled with documents. "Cordelia," he said, his voice steady, "you've broken more rules than anyone in this room, and I can prove it." The room fell silent. For the first time, Cordelia's confident mask cracked just slightly. She sneered, brushed him off, tried to change the subject, but everyone in the room had seen it. The shift, the flicker of fear. Ezra knew then, she wasn't untouchable. The truth group had gathered enough evidence to take this fight beyond the neighborhood. They hired a lawyer, prepared filings, and scheduled meetings with county officials. What started as a lonely battle over wildflowers had transformed into a full-scale investigation into one of the most corrupt HOAs the state had ever seen. Ezra also knew the fight wasn't over. Cordelia wasn't going to roll over quietly. The closer they got to exposing her, the more desperate she would become, and desperate people are dangerous. But Ezra was past the point of fear. He had built a home that could withstand storms, and now he was building a case that could topple an empire. The only question left was, how far would Cordelia go to stop him? By the time the hearings were scheduled, Pine Ridge was buzzing with attention no one could ignore. Neighbors whispered in driveways, boxes of evidence passed quietly from one hand to another, and the once proud HOA meetings that Cordelia had dominated turned into hostile standoffs. For the first time in years, people weren't afraid of her. They were waiting for her fall. Cordelia, of course, acted as though nothing was wrong. She swept into meetings with her usual icy composure, Rex trailing behind her like an obedient guard dog. She barked about standards and integrity, but her voice no longer carried the same power. Ezra could see it, the shift in the room. The fear she'd once inspired had begun to dissolve, replaced by quiet defiance. The day of the first official hearing arrived like a storm. Ezra stood in a county building, fluorescent lights humming above, binder in hand. Around him sat neighbors who had once been strangers, but were now allies in a shared cause. Some looked nervous. Others looked determined. All of them carried the same thought. This ends today. Cordelia entered the room in a sharp suit, her smile thin, her eyes cold. Rex lumbered behind her, jaw clenched, trying to look intimidating but only managing to look desperate. The proceedings began. Lawyers outlined charges, officials asked questions, and Ezra, calm as stone, began presenting his evidence. He laid it out piece by piece, forged amendments with Cordelia's handwriting, financial records showing funds siphoned into her cousin's companies, selective enforcement documented with photos and timestamps. He even displayed property maps proving she had illegally expanded HOA boundaries to pull in more homeowners under her control. Each page was another brick in the wall closing around Cordelia. Each testimony from a neighbor was another nail in the coffin of her false authority. When Rex was called to speak, his facade cracked. Under pressure, his answers grew shaky, then contradictory. Finally, faced with undeniable evidence, he broke. "Yes," he muttered, voice trembling. "She told me to do it. She made me write violations that weren't real, told me to keep people scared." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the sound of years of anger boiling over. Cordelia snapped toward him, eyes blazing with betrayal, but it was too late. The truth was out. From there, the dominoes fell fast. Investigators confirmed decades of fraud and embezzlement. The so-called maintenance funds had padded Cordelia's accounts for years. Rex confessed fully, striking a deal to lessen his punishment. Cordelia, furious and cornered, tried one last desperate act, storming out of the hearing as though she could simply walk away from the ruin she had created. But the sheriff was waiting at the door. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists as cameras flashed. For the first time, the Queen of Pine Ridge wasn't issuing fines or threats. She was being led away, powerless, her empire collapsing behind her. The fallout was swift and wide-reaching. The Pine Ridge HOA was dissolved, its fraudulent amendments voided, and its coffers audited. Families who had been bled dry by years of bogus fines received refunds. Homeowners who had lived in fear of liens and foreclosures finally breathed freely again. And Ezra Thornfield? He wasn't just vindicated, he was celebrated. His meticulous records, his refusal to bend, his determination to expose the truth had saved his community. Neighbors who once cowered under Cordelia's glare now stood proudly beside him, thanking him, calling him the man who gave Pine Ridge its freedom back. But Ezra didn't want a crown. He didn't want to rule where Cordelia had ruled. What he wanted was something simpler, purer, community. So together, the residents of Pine Ridge built something new. Not another HOA with bylaws and fines, but a cooperative built on trust and shared responsibility. They planted gardens, not just in Ezra's yard, but across the neighborhood. They organized potlucks, tool-sharing programs, and community workdays. Where there had once been fear, there was laughter. Where there had once been silence, there was connection. Ezra's home, once a symbol of rebellion against Cordelia, became a beacon of what the neighborhood could be. He hosted the first community gathering there, string lights glowing across his reclaimed wood porch, tables covered with dishes made by neighbors who finally felt free to enjoy each other's company. For Ezra, it was more than victory. It was healing. The home he had built in Marjorie's memory wasn't just his sanctuary anymore. It had become the heart of a community reborn, and the story of Pine Ridge didn't stay within its borders. News outlets picked it up. Legal journals wrote about it. Lawmakers pointed to it as a precedent, proof that corrupt HOAs could be toppled and justice restored. Across the country, homeowners facing their own battles took hope from Ezra's story. If he could stand up to Cordelia Blackthornne and win, maybe they could fight back too. Ezra often reflected on the journey. He thought about the wildflowers that had started it all, the simple natural beauty that Cordelia had tried to stamp out. Those flowers still grew by his porch, brighter than ever, attracting bees, butterflies, and neighbors who stopped to admire them. In the end, the battle wasn't just about bylaws or fines or property lines. It was about something bigger, the right to live in peace, to create beauty, to build a life without fear of petty tyrants. And as Ezra stood on his porch one evening watching the sun dip below the mountains, he felt it fully for the first time. Freedom. Hard-won, deeply earned, and shared with the people around him. The HOA had tried to break him. Instead, it had built him into a symbol of resistance, of truth, and of community. And in Pine Ridge, no one would ever forget the man who turned corruption into hope. What do you think? Should HOAs have this much power? Or is it time to rethink how neighborhoods are run? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. More unbelievable HOA stories are on the way.